Hello to my online learners. Today we are going to look at the heart and the structure. So chapter 15, we're going to identify the structures in the chambers, look at the layers, look at the valves, look at the way blood flows through it, look at the electrical system, a little bit about the sounds and how they relate to the closing of the valves, then also the ECG, which is relating to how the electrical impulses go, and then we'll look a little bit at nervous autonomic nervous control and cardiac output and stroke. So when we look at the heart is located, usually you use the nipples as a indicator or as a marking, and then it's just before it, or it's seen between the 4th and 5th intercostal space. The heart is a little off to the left side. Now, remember when you are looking at your heart or any other organ, you're looking at the body and labeling it based on the person. So this is the person's right side and this is the person's left side. So the heart goes a little off to the left. You've got the base at the top where the great vessels come out, and then you have the apex down below. And it's a little off midline. Now the heart muscle itself is located in a sac, a very tough fibrous sac with a couple of layers, and that's called the pericardium. So the pericardium, being a serous membrane, has the parietal layer, which is the outside, and you have the visceral layer, which then covers the gut part or the heart of it. So you've got many layers to the pericardium. So the pericardium goes around, and then underneath you have a muscle layer, and this is a form of cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle has the ability to conduct itself. With those intercalated discs, it allows the signal to spread. And then inside you have the endocardium. So endo, myo, epi, peri. And in the endocardium, that's where you want it nice and smooth, so you decrease the amount of friction of the blood flow. And it is squamous epithelial cell. Now, the heart itself, it sounds really complicated, but first off, pay more attention to main structures and then go from there, because if you're just trying to memorize it all, it's not as easy. So again, remember the left side is the right side, and it's as if you see in a person, so this is the left side. The whole idea of the right side of the heart is to collect blood from the body and send it to the lungs to get oxygenated. Then the left side of the heart is to collect it from the lungs and send it to the body. Now, easiest thing to look at are the chambers. So you start with the top chambers, which are not very muscular at all. They look a little muscular here, but when you look at them in an organism, they're really quite flappy and not that strong and not that muscular, but they don't have to be muscular because they're just collecting chambers. So the blood is collected in the atrium. On the right side, it's the right atrium. On the left side, it's the left atrium. So there are vessels that feed into the right atrium, and this is the great vessel, the superior vena cava. Vena cava is just Latin for the big vein. And then on the lower part is the inferior vena cava. So here's an example of how naming or your parts help your word. Inferior comes below, superior comes above, and it goes into the right atrium. Then the bottom chambers are the conducting chambers. So these are the ventricles. And the ventricles are quite muscular, and they're separated by a muscular wall called the meaning between, ventricular septum. So it's the divider between the ventricles. As to be compared with the interatrial septum, which is the divider between the atrium. Okay, the ventricles you will see are much more muscular. You've got the right ventricle on the right side and the left ventricle on the left side. As the blood comes through, it comes through valves. Valves help control the one-way movement of blood. And when the heart contracts, the valves close, not like a slamming of a door, but more, well, they don't actually slam shut, but they close because of the pressure of the heart preventing the backflow. And you have the tricuspid on the right side and the bicuspid or the mitral on the left side. And the way I remember this is you want to try before you buy. Let's look at this little introduction through this video.
Your heart is an extraordinary machine. During your lifetime, your heart's muscular walls pump blood into blood vessels branching throughout your body. Your heart has 4 chambers. 2 upper chambers, called the left and right atria,
your heart is an
and
extraordinary
2 lower chambers,
machine.
called the left and right ventricles,
During your
contract
lifetime,
in a
your
steady
heart's
rhythm
muscular
known
walls
as your
pump blood
heartbeat.
into blood vessels branching
During a
throughout
normal
your body.
heartbeat, blood from your tissues and lungs flows into your atria, then into your ventricles.
Heart has 4 chambers. 2 upper chambers,
Walls
called the
inside
left
your
and right
heart,
atria,
called the interatrial and interventricular septa,
and 2 lower
help keep the
chambers,
blood
called the
on left and right sides
ventricles,
from mixing.
contract in a steady rhythm known as your heartbeat. During a normal heartbeat, blood
2
from your
valves
tissues
sit
and
like
lungs
doors
flows
between
into
your
your
atria and ventricles to prevent
then
blood
into
from
your
flowing
ventricles.
backward into your atria. The tricuspid valve opens
Walls
into
inside
your
your
right
heart,
ventricle,
called the interatrial and interventricular
and the
septa,
bicuspid
help
valve,
keep the
also
blood
known
on
as
left
the
and right
mitral
sides
valve,
from
opens
mixing.
into your left ventricle. Strong, thin tissues, called chordae tendineae, hold your valves in place during the forceful contractions of your ventricles.
Blood from flowing backward into your atria.
Blood leaving the ventricles
tricuspid
passes
valve
through
opens
another
into
set of
your right
valves.
ventricle.
The pulmonary valve, between your right ventricle and
And the
pulmonary
bicuspid
trunk,
valve, also known as
and
the
the
mitral
aortic
valve,
valve,
opens
connecting
into
your left ventricle and aorta.
Strong, thin tissues, called chordae tendineae,
In order to pump
hold your
blood more
valves in place
efficiently,
during the
your heart
forceful
muscle,
contractions
called
of your
myocardium,
ventricles.
is arranged in a unique pattern.
Blood
3
leaving the
layers of
ventricles
myocardium
passes through
wrap
another
around the
set of
lower part of
valves.
your heart.
The pulmonary valve
They
between your
twist
right ventricle
and
and
tighten
pulmonary
in different
trunk,
directions to push blood
and the
through your
aortic
heart.
valve connecting your left ventricle and aorta.
Okay, so that video was a very good job at showing the chambers and showing the contraction. And the neat thing about that video is it shows that the left and the right pump at the same time. So it's actually a double chamber. We make it only sound like it only pumps one at a time just to go through the naming of it or the blood flowing through it. So we touched on the valves. These are the atrioventricular valves because they're between the atrium and the ventricle. So the one on the right is the tricuspid. The one on the left is the mitral or the bicuspid. Those will prevent blood from flowing backwards into the atrium. When the heart contracts, there are another set of valves, and these valves are named after the great vessels they go into, and they prevent blood from backflowing when the heart relaxes, because you want blood to flow one way and not backflow. The one that's in the pulmonary valve is the pulmonary artery is called the pulmonary valve. The one in the aortic artery, the big aorta, is called the aortic valve. Okay. Now, anything to do with the word pulmonary is a lung word. So the pulmonary valve is the valve on the way to the lungs. You'll see that the vessel that takes the blood away is the artery, and the vessel that brings the blood back from the veins is called the vein. The vessel that brings the blood back from the lungs is called the pulmonary vein. So here's the wonderful example of how arteries in the simplest form are vessels that take blood away, and arteries and veins are the vessels that bring blood back. Okay, and the pulmonary artery and pulmonary vein go against the rule that all arteries are oxygenated. Because the blood is going away from the heart, it's an artery, but it hasn't been to the lungs yet, so it's not oxygenated. So that's why in this situation, you will see that the pulmonary artery is blue. Okay? Now, when you're looking at the other words associated with it, we talked about the chordae tendineae, or showed it in the video. The chordae tendineae are these very strong fibrous cords that anchor the flap of the valves to the wall. And this prevents it adds strength, sort of like a hinge on a gate, and it prevents the blood from going backwards, and it adds structure to the valve. Okay, and then with the chordae tendineae, you also have a papillary muscle, and papillary is kind of a word for a bump, and papillary muscles there. And we've talked about all the rest. So again, it sounds complicated, but it's not overly complicated if you break it down, and you need to visualize. So if we were going to talk about the blood flow through the heart, let's make it red. The blood comes in from the body through the vena cava, the inferior and superior. It is collected in the right atrium, goes through the atrioventricular valve into the right ventricle. Then, when the heart contracts, the blood leaves the right ventricle, going out to the pulmonary artery to the lungs. Then, in the lungs, it is oxygenated. So then it comes back oxygenated from the left lung in the left pulmonary vein, and in the right lung, the right pulmonary vein. And then notice that this vein comes over here and empties in here. Then the pulmonary veins will collect into the left atrium. The blood goes through the left atrioventricular valve, also called the mitral valve, and it goes through the aortic valve, and from the aorta goes through the aortic arch and down through the body to the descending aorta. Okay, now realize you can't quite see it because of the angle I've got, but there are 3 vessels that come off the top of the aorta. This one they go to the head and the arms. Okay, please make sure you can label a diagram and also tell me the order of the blood flowing through the heart. Good. The next thing we're going to look at, oops, not that one, this one, is the pathway, the conduction system. So as the heart is specifically unique in that it has this conduction system to transfer the electrical signal.
When special cells, called pacemaker cells, generate electrical signals inside your heart, the heart muscle cells, called myocytes, contract as a group. Your heart is divided into left and right halves, which work together like a dual pump. On the right side of your heart, deoxygenated blood from your body's tissues flows through large veins called the superior and inferior vena cava into your right atrium.
The heart muscle cells,
Next, the blood moves into your right ventricle, which contracts and sends blood out of your heart to your lungs to gather oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. On the left side of your heart, oxygen-rich blood from your lungs flows through your pulmonary veins into your left atrium. The blood then moves into your left ventricle, which contracts and sends blood out of your heart through the aorta
Next, the
to
blood
feed
moves
your
into
cells
your
and
right ventricle,
tissues.
which contracts and sends blood out of your heart to your lungs to
The
gather
first
oxygen
branches
and get
off
rid
your
of carbon
aorta are the
dioxide.
coronary
On the
arteries,
left
which
side of
supply your
heart,
heart muscle with
oxygen-rich blood
oxygen
from
and
your lungs
nutrients.
flows through your pulmonary
At the top of
veins
your
into your
aorta,
left atrium.
arteries branch
The
off
blood
to
then
carry
moves
blood
into
to your
left
head and
ventricle,
arms.
which contracts and
Arteries
sends blood out
branching
of
from
your
the
heart
middle and lower
through
parts
the
of your aorta
to
supply
feed your
blood
cells
to the
and
rest of your
tissues.
body.
Good. So that goes
The first
through the
branches
basics
off
of
your
it.
aorta are the
Let's look
coronary
at the
arteries,
conduction
which supply
system
your heart muscle
in
with
your
oxygen
heart.
and nutrients. At the top of your aorta, arteries branch off to carry blood to your head and arms. Arteries branching from the middle and lower
The
parts of
heart
your
has
aorta
this
supply
unique
blood to the rest
cardiac
of your
muscle
body.
fiber to it. And a little bit of review again. The cardiac muscle system is, so they're branched. They have a lot of nuclei. Each cell has a nuclei. And there are these intercalated discs which result in the connections, and they allow the muscle impulse to be conducted from one cell to another. And this happens because there are small gap junctions in between them, and they allow for the muscle, the cardiac muscle, to conduct a wave-like pattern, especially important for conducting or for pumping the blood. Also, you'll see especially large mitochondria because you need to have a lot of aerobic respiration. Okay, good. Now, when we look at the conduction for the electrical signal going through the heart, trying to get that all on one page. Close. I'll just move off the vessels. So you have, number one, you have the SA node, the sinoatrial node. So here's the SA node. This is where the the nerves act on it. The sinoatrial node will then pass the information to the atrioventricular node. The atrioventricular node then passes it down the interseptal bundles. Then you come to what is called the bundle of His. Then it breaks into bundle branches, and then it spreads to the very end called Purkinje fibers. Notice it's a capital P because of the guy it's named after. So this is the order it goes through, and as the signal goes through, it causes a contraction in a certain way, and the electrical signal changes as it goes. Electrical signal causes different activity as it moves through. That electrical activity is picked up by an electrocardiogram. Now, the electrocardiogram is called the ECG, sometimes called an EKG, because it was developed in Germany, and cardio starts with a K in Germany. We're going to pay attention to just mainly the waves. The segments are also important, but we're more concerned with the waves. We've got the P wave, the QRS spike or complex, and then you have the T wave. So the P wave has to do with atrial depolarization. Okay, a few words to describe some of the terminology we're dealing with. So when you have depolarization, this is the action of the electrical signal. Okay, and the action of the electrical signal will cause the heart muscle to contract. And the process of any contraction is called systole. Okay, lots of words in a lot of terminology. So depolarization is the electrical signal causes the muscle to contract, and that is systole. Then we look at the opposite, and that's repolarization. And that is the relaxation of the, so that would be the the re-establishing of the electrical potential. Okay, and that is usually causes the heart muscle to relax, and that is paired up with the term diastole. Okay, so depolarization is the opposite of repolarization. Depolarization is the electrical event. Repolarization is the reestablishment. Then when you have contraction, that is called systole, and relaxation is called diastole. Let's look at one of my favorite videos of coordinating all these activities together.
The heart's conduction system controls the generation and propagation of electrical signals, or action potentials, that cause the heart's muscles to contract and the heart to pump blood. This electrical activity can be measured at electrodes placed at specific points on the skin, from which a composite recording is produced in the form of a graph. This recording is known as an electrocardiogram, or ECG, sometimes referred to as an EKG, a tracing of the overall electrical activity of the heart, resulting from the propagation of many action potentials. Let's look at what happens during a single beat of the heart and how these events are depicted on an ECG. In a normal heart, each beat begins in the right atrium with an action potential signal from the sinoatrial or SA node, the heart's natural pacemaker. The signal spreads across both atria, causing the muscle cells to depolarize and contract, inducing a phase known as atrial systole.
Okay, let's look at that. So the P wave is associated with the signal starting in the SA node, the sinoatrial node, and then as the signal goes through the atrium, both the left and the right, it will cause the depolarization of the atrium and the contraction of the atrium, resulting in the P wave.
On the ECG, this atrial depolarization is represented by the P wave. The period of conduction that follows atrial systole and precedes the contraction of the ventricles is depicted on the ECG by the PR segment, a flat line following the P wave. When the signal leaves the atria, it enters the ventricles via the atrioventricular or AV node, located in the interatrial septum. It enters the bundle of His and spreads through the bundle branches and the large diameter Purkinje fibers along the ventricle wall. By the PR segment. As the signal spreads through the ventricles, the contractile fibers depolarize and contract very rapidly, inducing ventricular systole. The ECG's QRS complex represents this rapid ventricular depolarization. Atrial repolarization also occurs at this time, but any atrial activity is hidden on the ECG by the QRS complex, inducing a phase known as atrial systole, Purkinje fibers along the ventricle.
Okay, so let's summarize. So the QRS complex is the electrical signal coming through the AV node down the bundle branches and up the Purkinje fibers. So that's where the signal is. Because of the signal, you have depolarization, and the depolarization will cause the contraction of the ventricles and the QRS complex. Now realize that after something contracts, it needs to relax. So in the first step, we contracted the atrium. So now it needs to relax, and it would have a repolarization signal, but it's just a small signal. So it is lost in the big QRS complex, and we don't see the signal.
Septum. It enters the bundle of His and spreads through the bundle branches and the large diameter Purkinje fibers along the ventricle walls. As the signal spreads through the ventricles, the contractile fibers depolarize and contract very rapidly, inducing ventricular systole. The ECG's QRS complex represents this rapid ventricular depolarization. Atrial repolarization also occurs at this time, but any atrial activity is hidden on the ECG by the QRS complex. Finally, as the signal passes out of the ventricles, the ventricular walls start to relax, inducing ventricular systole, a state described as ventricular diastole. The dome-shaped T wave on the ECG marks this ventricular repolarization.
Okay.
On the ECG,
so we had the ventricles contract. It's the strongest activity, so that's why we have the big spike. In order for it to recover, the ventricles have to relax, and in the process of relax, they repolarize, and this repolarization is captured in the T wave. So now the whole heart is relaxed, and it will allow blood to flow in at this time.
The ST segment depicts the period when the ventricles are depolarized. The QT interval represents the time it takes for both depolarization and repolarization of the ventricles to occur. The sequence of events just described and the associated ECG trace repeats with every heartbeat. Remember, an ECG is not a tracing of a single action potential, but an amalgamation of the many action potentials that constitute the electrical activity of the heart.
Okay, a little reminder, the ECG is not one heartbeat, it is, or one electrical signal or one cell. It is the average electrical signal of the heart. And also you can change the shape of the signal if you change the location of the leads, because sometimes if you go down very ventricular, it will go upside down, and the more leads you have, the more complicated the signal. We're going to stick really basic. P wave is to do with atrial contraction or atrial depolarization. QRX complex is ventricle contraction or ventricle depolarization and atrial repolarization. Then the T wave is the ventricular repolarization or ventricular relaxation. Okay, we're going to stop the video for there now, and I will continue on with the rest on the next video.